Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, from Florida to Washington, from Maine to California. This is George Norrie broadcasting with Coast to Coast AM. Welcome to the high desert, or something like that. Tonight, Rex will be interviewing Rob Robles about his Bigfoot fieldwork experiences. Stick around, you won't want to miss this. Okay, so this is someone you probably never heard interviewed before. At least I've never heard him interviewed, and I wanted to get someone on who I've not heard give a full interview yet on this topic. Some people you've heard at least once somewhere on the internet, and some you've heard over and over again. I'm not saying that they aren't interesting, but I think it's also interesting to hear new accounts of people doing research. My guest has been going into the woods most of his adult life, and he's been going in the woods with his equipment to look for Bigfoot here in Utah. Rob Robles, if you wouldn't mind just telling us how you got in this field of interest and about your first encounter.
Yeah, sure, Rex. Well, I don't call myself a researcher. I'm just kind of a guy that walks around in the woods, but I do it a lot. And I would say this was more accidental. I've always been interested in this topic. In fact, as a little kid, I remember checking out books about Yetis and Sasquatches before anybody knew anything about them. And this was even before the Patterson-Gimlin film back in the early 60s, from the school library. But the first thing I would say would be such a questionable encounter was that years ago, I was hiking in the mountains in central Nevada. Now, I've always had an interest in the outdoors, and what I would do is I travel out to the area between Ely and Elko, Nevada, and that's along the old Pony Express and Gold Miner Trail that went through central Nevada. And I enjoyed following that trail through a number of the different mountain ranges. Incredibly dry, just what you'd expect it to be in Nevada. Desolate, nothing. But I did see a lot of wild horses, and there is game out there. Very, very sparse water. And so the thought that there could be a Bigfoot is never anything that even crossed my mind. But I've been into really tough to access canyons. I had an ATV, a four-wheel drive ATV, and I would even have to get out there with a saw at times to saw my trails through the brush because these paths hadn't been, no one had been on them in years. So I remember, and I'd spend even sometimes a full day cutting trail just so I could access a particular area. Well, I got into one such canyon. It was in the Buck Mountains, which is mountain range, unless you're familiar with that area in Nevada you've never heard of. And but it's got a number of areas. There's a Roost Mountain, there's a Robber's Roost Ridge, there's things like this, and this intrigued me. So I was in this area and researching all these surrounding canyons. Again, there wasn't a lot of water, but some of the canyons were pretty deep, very sheer walls, and it would be very cool and a little bit moist. At least there'd be a little bit of greenery in the bottom of these canyons. Well, I had found in all the research, and you have to understand, I had been doing this for like 4 or 5 years, and I would go up 20, maybe 30 days a year in this area in Nevada. So this wasn't just some, I went up once or twice. No, I probably spent at least 100 days at least before I got to this point where I got into this one canyon, and I found what I thought at first was an old prospector or an old settler's cabin or the parts of a cabin. Now, I had found several such cabins, so many I can't really tell you right offhand, but close to 10 or 12 scattered in different areas before, some of which were mapped and some of which weren't. This was completely different than the others. This one was built with stone walls, not really any wood to it because there wasn't a lot of wood in the area, but it was built so that it could not accommodate a roof. You could not have put a roof on this structure, which really puzzled me because all the other structures that I saw, they may have been fallen in or they may have only partially been there, but they were designed with a roof to protect the people that were going to be sheltered in those structures. But this one wasn't designed like that. So I didn't really know what to think of it, and it was in a canyon that I'm certain no one had been up probably in 100 years because I'd literally had to cut my trail in there. I probably spent 2 trips just cutting the trail to access this little canyon with saws and shovels and like to get up to this place. Well, anyway, I'd been up there a number of times and going a little further every time. And one time I decided to go up as far as I possibly could in this canyon. This is maybe my 7th or 8th time up there. And I came to the top of the canyon. Now, you have to understand, it's kind of a wash. It's sandy. It's not really wet, but the sand is moist, okay? So you can tell that when it rained, at least there was water there, and sure there were places where it would held water. And if I dug in the sand, I'm sure I would have found water. I get to the top, and there's kind of a not really a rock fall, but a big rock slab that I literally had to climb up on my hands and knees to get up to the top of it. And it went up about 40 feet. And I got up above this, and I'm in an incredibly brushy area. So brushy that you literally can't see more than about 20 feet in any direction as I'm fighting through this stuff. And this is the only place in this whole canyon where I had come to this heavy a brush. I hadn't seen this anywhere else in this canyon as long as I'd been going up there. Anyway, I'm out there hiking and fiddling around for a few hours, and I get to what's kind of a clearing, a little bit of a, but I still can't see. The most is about 30 feet in any direction. And then suddenly off to the right and uphill. Now, it's a very narrow little bottom of this canyon. So literally 50 feet one way you start going uphill, and 50 feet the other way you start going uphill, and I'm in the bottom. I hear this crashing. I mean, just thunderous crashing, not just some little squirrel running through the brush, just some great big something moving through the brush. Now, the only large animal I had seen in this desert where I'd seen several elk. So I figured, well, it could be an elk. It wouldn't have been a wild horse. There were a lot of wild horses out there, but they didn't go into these heavy brush areas. They stayed out in the open. They could see things. So I figured, well, I guess it's an elk. And anyway, it comes crashing down the hill towards me. I'm listening to it. Now, this wasn't just 2 or 3 seconds. This was 30 seconds or longer that's crashing down towards me. It crashes in front of me because the brush is so heavy you can't silently move through this stuff. And it's moving reasonably quickly. I mean, like the speed of a man running through the brush, but not really fast because, again, the brush is so thick. And then it goes off, and it got close to me just out of sight. I mean, it probably had to be 50 feet away from me because I could see it if it was about 30 feet away. And I didn't see any brush moving when I got to the closest point. And then it veered off and then continued up to the left side of me, crashing through the brush, and then finally kind of petered out uphill on the left side.
So
Bigfoot didn't even come to my mind. I figured, well, I guess that had to be an elk, but I had no idea what it would have been. Go ahead, Rex.
So did it seem like it was headed straight your direction, but then it somehow sensed you and kind of bypassed you and kept going full speed ahead, just slightly altering it? I don't know if you could tell that from down in the gully where you're at.
Well, now that I've listened to accounts and things like that, I'm certain probably what it was doing was bluff charging me and then veered off and veered away. At the time, I just thought it was a wayward elk, running towards me at first and then veering away. But you see, I've kicked out elk, well, hundreds of times. I mean, all kinds of times. They never run towards you and then run away. They always run straight away. I mean, even I've run across little fawns there in the mountains, and the does don't run towards you. They run away from you. They leave the fawns behind, curled up on the ground. And so the fact that it had come towards me and then veered away was not something that an elk would have done. Now that I look back on it, at the time, though, I figured that's what it had to be because that's the only thing I'd seen up there.
Even something that, I don't know any animals that type of terrain that they're going to move very quickly, whether it's a human or elk. They usually, if it's thick sagebrush, they're going to kind of go through it slowly unless they have like a animal trail to follow or something.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a human because a human, first of all, wouldn't have been crashing through that heavy brush. Exactly. It wouldn't have been moving like that. Yeah. And like I said, it was within about 200 yards of this really bizarre cabin structure that I saw. Again, I had to think, well, I guess I couldn't explain it. Because a person, I've never seen something like that a person would build. Because the only thing I could see that could do is really be a windbreak because it wouldn't keep the snow or rain off of you. Because, like I said, you couldn't have put a roof on it. But and it was definitely stacked walls. I mean, it wasn't a perfect square either, like a human will build a little square room. You know what I mean? It was kind of an odd ball. It was all enclosed, but it was, I don't know. I used to, in geometry in school, I could have told you the name of the shapes, but it wasn't square. It was some screwball kind of angles that people just typically don't do. But anyway, that was happened. That happened probably 12 years ago, 15 years ago. Didn't think too much of it until the last few years.
Okay, and that was my next question. I was going to ask about what time period were we talking about. So, yeah, before around 2000 or something after that, I guess, in that
Yeah,
area.
that would have been in the early 2000s,
Okay.
2002, 3, somewhere like that.
And I know you've told me that story before, but I didn't know that you were that methodical out there, that spending that many days out in that area. I've been out in Nevada. You know, you go, at least from Utah, you take Highway 6 past Delta, and then you see the sign that warns you that there's no services within, 90 miles or something like that. And then you finally get to the Nevada border. There's a ghost town called Osceola. It's an old
Right.
mining town. And I've been out that far, but I know Ely's even out past beyond that. There's, I think, a place where you can mine for garnets and things. And there's, yeah, lots of little deserted ghost towns and things. But I've never been out quite that far. So anyway, it
Yeah,
is a really barren area, I can confirm.
the thing that really appealed to me is that, I mean, it is so desolate out there. There
Right.
is no one, and there hasn't been anybody in years. When you hike around in Utah, you find,
People,
even places, yeah, you find cartridges, shotgun shells
exactly. Yeah.
or pop tops from cans back from 30, 40 years ago when we used to have tin cans that had little pop tops on them. You find that stuff. You found nothing like that in this area in Nevada. People had not been out there. I found old graves along the Pioneer Trail, and I knew they were graves because they were kind of like triangular stones, but big, maybe 40, 50-pound stones, stand up on its corner, in the ground. I don't know if you can kind of see what I'm talking about,
Yeah. Yeah.
but just standing straight up in the air like that. I found a campsite that I figured probably there had used to have been an old cavalry station out there near Ruby Lake. And I found what I figured was a camping ground where they spent one night, because I found a bunch of little areas where little rock walls were built, what would have been around a fire, okay? And the idea of the rocks were set up to be like a screen to radiate the heat towards someone who'd be sleeping by the fire. But it wasn't like one or two. It was like there were 30 or 40 of these things in a area, 20 square yards, area. I mean, really interesting. I mean, just out in the middle of nowhere. Why would somebody do all these things other than there would have had to been some soldiers that would have done this? The Indians didn't do that. And then I found all sorts of little Indian areas with Indian arrowheads. Every source of water, or where there had been water, you'll find chipped arrowheads and broken arrowheads out in that Nevada desert. You'll find
Yeah.
that everywhere out there.
Yeah, northwestern Nevada population is really low today. And back when there were miners, you're finding antiques out there. I've seen places where you're finding steel cans with solder on them. That's nothing that's recent. It's just things from the old timers that were mining out there and things like that. But yeah, in Utah, it seems like there's a culture where everybody goes into the woods and things on the weekends, and there's a lot of people, at least down the I-15 corridor. So you're thinking in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden this family pops over the ridge and starts walking, through the woods or something. They don't get very far off the trails, but I'm just contrasting this with Nevada, where there's nothing except for, like you were saying, old relics and things like that. So anyway,
Yeah, that really fascinated me. And I'm into these old antique firearms from the 1800s, so that sort of stuff always has really, really appealed to me. So that was a big reason why I did that. And then in Utah, that kind of ran its course, and I started doing the same thing, just hiking in some nearby canyons, because I live right near some beautiful canyons here in Utah, and I just started doing that, hiking all the trails in the nearby canyons. This was several years ago.
so let's go ahead and I guess get into some of the Sasquatching you've done in Utah. One last thing I'll mention, I was just thinking, and there's a guy, his name, what is it, Desert Sasquatch or Desert, yeah, I think that's what it is, and he's out in Nevada, so there are other people who have found Sasquatch out there, even if you think that a lot of it is too dry for them, but if there's water and it's remote and there's not a lot of people, I guess they still find a way to subsist out there with some games. So while maintaining the confidentiality of the areas here in Utah, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your research areas and perhaps some of your dealings with, I know you've met with local wildlife officers or forest rangers, and they've, told you a handful of stories, and anything you're comfortable sharing, we're happy to hear that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I've gotten to know all the camp hosts and the Forest Service guys, because I'm in these areas all the time, and I'd always drop in and see them and just become friendly with them, because I've always found that paid in whatever I did to get the stories. But this started here, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. I spent literally a whole summer just hiking all of the trails in a nearby canyon to where I live. And I never really saw anything that I could definitely say was any Sasquatch structure or the like, but I stayed right on the trails, okay? And, but there's beautiful canyon, and that's what I did it for, is out there for exercise and to see the beautiful scenery. Well, that winter I happened to get online, and I found Rio with his Utah Sasquatch and started watching some of his videos and listening to him. And I was fascinated particularly with how he found structures, finding tree lanes and the like, because I'd seen some of these things, but never really thought too much of them as I'd been hiking around. So the next spring, when I got out there, because I typically get out there right when I haven't been out there yet, but I'm toying with going out there this Saturday, depending on how clear the mountain's going to be. I went out and started, rather than just hanging on the trails, I'd hike along the trails until I'd find something that I thought was a tree lane or structure, and then I'd hike out towards it, and then I'd try to locate another structure and hike towards that. And that's kind of how it started, doing this sort of thing. And it's kind of gone from there. And in the process now that I've been doing this, because now when I hike, I don't just hike trails. I'm off the trail all the time. I know the canyons like the back of my hand, so I'm not worried about getting lost, because I know right where I am, because I've been all over the places. I found all sorts of stuff. I mean, so much stuff, so much in the way of tree lanes and structures, that it's unbelievable to me that there isn't more of this reported, and there isn't more people making a big deal about this stuff. Because it would take an army of men out there in the woods constantly building this stuff to make and build all the stuff that I've seen. And yet nobody's ever seen anybody building these things. And I've talked to all the Forest Service people, all the camp hosts, all the everything. No one's ever seen anybody doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I know there are, well, maybe we'll go into that more later, people who insist there's no evidence that Sasquatch makes structures. Obviously, nobody's seen them make them, but they haven't seen humans make them either. And I think you've had a few stories where basically a structure will appear overnight, kind of right under the nose of forest rangers who are literally sleeping there, and they wake up the next morning, and then all of a sudden they have a structure they could hear some ruckus out there, but it would take a whole, like you're saying, a whole crew of humans to do it that quickly.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's one of them. I went up, this was right around March 1st here, a couple of years ago, as a nearby canyon, and as soon as they opened the road, in fact, I was in touch with the camp host, and he told me, okay, we opened the road today. So I went up there the first day, and I wasn't able to get all the way up the canyon, but was able to get to a picnic spot. And lo and behold, in this picnic spot, now you have to understand, this is probably 6 or 7 miles straight up the canyon road from the mouth of the canyon where the canyon had been closed all winter, okay, this picnic spot. And this is the first day that the road has been open, that they've let anybody up there. I come to the picnic spot, and right in the middle of the picnic spot is this structure. I mean, it's literally right next to a picnic table, made out of hundreds of pine tree boughs, fresh boughs, literally cut within the last, well, I think within the last couple of days, but within a week or 2 weeks at the most in age. Right next to a picnic table. I mean, and the thing is that it's not really a sleeping structure. It's more like a screen to hide behind, but it's big, it's tall. It's, 12 feet tall and accommodate maybe 4 or 5 adult men standing inside of it, but you're visible from the road on the inside of it. The outside hide you from whatever's inside the campground, which there was nothing in the campground. Nobody had been up there yet, So I go back, I think, well, this is really odd. So I'm thinking, well, I'm going to set some cameras on this thing. I'm back. I go back there a couple of days. And when I get up there a couple of days later, the structure was like triple the size. It was unbelievable. Now you've got a mountain of boughs, okay, in this campground, okay, that have suddenly appeared. And I'm the only person that I've seen up that road, you know what I mean, because we're that early in the year. Well, anyway, I set these cameras about it. Nothing ever happens with it that I'm actually able to record. At least I record people, but I don't record anything else. And eventually, as the weather warms and you start to get campers out there, the people tear it all apart because apparently they're using the boughs to burn them in their fireplaces. So eventually it gets all hauled away. But that was an example of something that got built completely inexplicable. Now you'd say, well, a homeless guy did it. No homeless guy walked 4 or 5 miles up the canyon, built a structure in an area where he couldn't have laid down in because there's rocks and stuff all over the ground, and would have spent the kind of time it would have taken to get those boughs. And believe me, those boughs weren't torn off of trees right next to where you were at, because remember, we're in a picnic area. All the boughs right down near the ground have already been ripped off years before. These things had to be brought from quite a ways away to build this thing. Why would a person build it there? Well, I don't think a person would build it there. You know, that's the most inexplicable thing. I guess it was a screen, and maybe there was some game crossing through this campground, but a person sure isn't going to do that. It's no hunting season. They couldn't hunt turkeys. You couldn't hunt anything. And besides, you can't hunt in the middle of a campground anyway. So anyway, that's just one of multiple examples I've seen.
Yeah, that'd be my guess too. I was thinking something to hide from game, maybe in the daytime or even at nights, probably even more especially, just to pounce on them or something like that, it sounds like. Also, and I've looked at some of those structures, things like you're talking about with the pine boughs, and sometimes you'll get one that it looks like it's the very tip top of a pine tree, like it was maybe a 30-foot pine and they ripped off the top of it, something where a human couldn't even reach. So anyway, it's just another little detail I've noticed of those things.
Yeah. And sometimes you get incorporated, you'll see tops of trees or sticks or poles that clearly have been cut. But the ones that I think are these structures or Sasquatch structures definitely have the preponderance of them are broken off and have been hauled in from outside the area, or not by outside the area, I mean not within, 100 feet. They've been hauled in from who knows where. Another story I've got is at the camp host. This was, I think, summer before last. He called me and says, hey, look, a structure has just appeared in the campground here. Now, it appeared last night. This was later in the summer. And he says, there's been nobody in the campground. I mean, so no kids have been in here to do this. Nobody spent the night in the campground. So why don't you come up? So I went up there that day. He saw it the day before, okay? I went up there that day and was very lightly sprinkling, okay? I go to the camp spot that he said, and it was gone. There was a dry spot, though, on the campground where the structure had been,
so that was
okay?
Bad.
But the structure was gone. It was there the day before. He called me that day. I got up there the next morning. It had just started to rain. Other than him and me, we were the only two people that that's seen in the campground. And you have to understand, he's a camp host, so his spot is right near the entrance. Nobody had driven in there. Nobody spent the night in there. And I'm in there up there during the week. I have a job, but I can get away anytime I kind of want to. And during the week is when I tend to do most of this stuff. And it was gone, other than I could see the dry spot. And I looked around for where it had been moved to. I couldn't find it. I imagine it had just been hauled off in who knows how many different directions. I asked him about it. He came over with me. He said, well, this is where it was. It was here yesterday. And but that was, and why was it built, number one? And then why was it dismantled and disappeared overnight? It's just inexplicable, and too much work. I mean, kids just won't do that, I was a kid growing up in areas like this. They're not into doing things that, they'll go fiddle around and spend an hour doing it, but they're not going to spend 8 or 10 hours building something, then taking it apart. And then, but first of all, the kids would have had to get in there, and there hadn't been any kids in that campground.
So yeah, a lot of weird stories that people have about Sasquatch or things related to structures, things you just can't quite write off as being human activity, whether it's, sometimes people will say, oh, there's a troop of scouts that may have created something. Well, that may be at times, but often they'll use, things like paracord, and it has a certain look to it, and it doesn't just disappear or reappear overnight. You don't do it under the nose of the park ranger without his knowledge. Kids aren't that good at evading and that type of thing. So anyway, do you have any theories as to why they're making structures? I've heard a handful of them. I don't know if obviously I don't think anybody knows for sure, but did you have any thoughts that have crossed your mind in your experience with?
Well, yeah, I see several different kinds of structures. Okay. Let me give you another example here. Okay, this was in a nearby campground. I think you may have seen these, Rex. When I had been going to this campground, this was a different camp. There's a bunch of campgrounds I go to. This is a different one. And there had always been several different structures, screens or little shelter structures or that, in and around this campground. Well, this was, again, I think, I don't remember if it was last spring or the spring before last. I went up into this campground around the end of May. And there was one basic little shelter structure, kind of a lean-to, a pole in the middle with poles lined up on it on both sides, so kind of like a tent or a pup tent, but something that somebody could lay down in. There was one of those, and there was a little kind of brush put together, you know what I mean, in more of what I'd call a debris hut. Well, in this one particular spot, I went up there and saw that. I came back in 30 days, right at the end of June, and there was literally what I would call a village that had been built in this time frame. Now, in this time, there had been one large central structure, okay, that would have housed several individuals because it was kind of in almost like a horseshoe shape, heavy brush all around it, green boughs all over it, so it was just freshly built. There was a center entrance to it, and then another entrance, so you could kind of have two areas you could lay in, okay? Then right across from that, there was a smaller structure, very small, and only something very small could have crawled into this structure, okay? But this was within 20 feet of this larger structure in the center. Then in addition to that, 50 feet towards the campground, there was a lean-to, a larger lean-to that a brush piled against that looked like it had been a screen or like a lookout post. Then as you got closer to the campground, there were another 3 different screens, which were basically poles laid between 2 trees and then sticks lined up along the poles so that something could have laid down in the dirt and kind of used them as a vantage point, but could have only really been concealed when they were laying down. One of those was built right overlooking a campground, okay? On the other side from this central structure, there was another one of these tall lean-to type structures where, again, something large would have been standing or could have been standing in it. And then there were a couple more of these small little structures where you'd lay behind with poles lined up against them to cut out your outline. Now, the really interesting thing with these little screens, the one with the poles down near the ground, is that they had grass mats, okay, laid on the ground. So whatever person or whatever creature could lay down. Now, this was the interesting thing with the grass mats. The grass was aligned so that each strand of grass laid parallel to each other. Now, do you see what I'm getting at? They weren't tied or made into a carpet, but they were individual grass stems were laid next to each other and making kind of a mat, okay, that this thing could have laid on. And this was on 3 or 4 of these areas that I figured were screens where these things laid on the ground, okay? Now, in addition to this, there were other things. There were areas where there were sticks laid on the ground, again, all parallel to each other, that I figured somebody or something had sat on, used them to keep themselves out of the mud. And this thing had suddenly appeared. Now, it had taken a couple of weeks, but this was an enormous amount of work. And this was within 200 yards of a campground where there's all kinds of people. Again, made in ways that people wouldn't do it. And there were animal bones inside that big central structure I talked about. There were animal bones in there, freshly, because the bones were still red where meat had been eaten or gnawed off of them. You know what I mean, inside those things. This thing was fascinating. And it was still, parts of it were still visible last summer and last fall.
Do you have anything that I would say to people who, there are scientists, I won't name them and I don't want to criticize them, that say that there's no evidence that Sasquatch makes structures. Scientific evidence is one thing, but all this preponderance of circumstantial evidence, to me, really points to it, maybe not in a scientific way, but it seems like what else is making it? You have to kind of narrow it down just by logic. And for instance, I'll just share something really quickly of my own. And I'll even just tell kind of where this is. It's kind of between Merrick Canyon and Mount Timpanogos. There's an area where basically there's 7 tree lanes that are all converging on this one live tree. It's large enough that a human could not have physically done that without heavy equipment. And it's arranged enough that nature's not just going to produce that normally. I actually sent a video of this to someone, and they kind of dismissed it and said, I don't see anything distinctive about it because there's so much deadfall in the area. But anyway, what are your thoughts on people who insist there's no evidence that Sasquatch makes structures or that type of thing?
Well, those people just don't get off their butts and get out in the woods and look, okay? I've got another canyon other than what I just talked to you about, and, one thing that Sasquatch they'll see is you'll have these treelings, these teepees against trees and the like. And I had pointed this out because I had been with, a fellow we both know pretty well. I don't know if you want me to mention his name or not. But we were up in this canyon, and the thing that was surprising to me is you had all these aspens. We had an area of pines, an area of aspens. And you'd have an area of 50 yards square of pines, and then there'd be an area similar size of aspens and pines and aspens. They tend to be in groups. Right. A little bit of aspens mixing with the pines. A little bit. Yep. Yeah, but kind of these separate groups. Well, in the pines, you would find now hundreds, and I literally mean there was one area where there must have been, as I hiked along the ridge, over 1,000 aspen trees, okay, that had been all pulled out of the ground. They hadn't been chopped. They'd been pulled out of the ground, moved over, leaned up against a tree, and sometimes you'd find 2 or 3 against a pine tree. Sometimes you'd find 15 against a pine tree. All around it in kind of in circles. And almost all of the aspens that were moved into the pines had the bark stripped off of them. Not all of them, but I would say 80% of them or more had the bark stripped off of them. And as I walked along, it finally dawned on me, hey, all the trees that have been moved into here are aspens, and they're all leaning up against pine trees. Now, and I said, well, could they have just grown that way and then fallen over, as unlikely as that was? And sure enough, every aspen that I pulled on, I was able to pull it up and see where the end had basically been wiggled back and forth and broken off. It hadn't been chopped with an axe. It hadn't been sawed with a chainsaw. It had been broken off. And that's the way I would think it would have been broken. It just wiggled back and forth until it broke and cracked and then hauled over into these pines. Now, at first I wondered, well, first of all, who's going to do? This would have taken an army of men to do this. Unbelievable amount of work. Would scouts do this? Hey, I was in scouts. You know what I mean? Scouts didn't do this stuff. Okay. And I went to the extreme in scouts. I was in the Order of the Arrow, an Eagle Scout. And this is not something, nobody did this in scouts. Okay. Or in scouting. Okay. This wasn't something they did. And it finally dawned on me that what this was likely is that they were basically eating the bark off of these aspen trees. Now, when I looked at that, I said, well, is that even edible? So I went to the internet and started looking it up. And sure enough, an Indian tribe back east called the Algonquins. And what the Algonquin means in their language is bark eater. And it was actually well known back in the 1800s that in time of famine or in tough winters, Indians and settlers would eat the barks of certain trees, not the outside bark, the inside bark, the Cambrian layer, the living area where the trees are. And it's only maybe a quarter of an inch thick, of pulpy stuff between the hardwood and the outside of the bark. And they would eat that stuff. And the way you access it is by stripping the bark off the trees and then gnawing on the inside of this bark. And sure enough, I figured that's what had to have been going on. This is probably the winter food source for these things when there's not an awful lot of food around. Now, can I prove that? No. But I challenge anybody. Hey, if you don't think there's something going on, come with me out in the woods and look at this. And you give me an explanation on how this stuff is suddenly here. And why are the aspens all leaning in the pines, but the aspens are not leaning against other aspens in the aspens? Okay. Explain that to me. Okay. Well, there is an explanation for that. My explanation for it is that the Sasquatch, their activities, they keep it to where there's a canopy because they're less visible. Okay. And in the pines, they're much less visible than out in the aspen. So they'll go and rip a tree up and then haul it over to the pines where they do stuff with it because they can't be seen from as long a distance. Or it may be a little warmer. They do offer a little better shelter, a little better windbreak than what you're going to get in the aspens because they're bigger trees and they're denser. But that's my solution to it, or my answer to it.
Okay, yeah, and I agree with you. Just a couple points. I know, you mentioned Rio, and he's kind of started even though he's kind of, I don't want to say disappeared, but he's, taking a break, or at least he's not posting on the internet anymore. He's focusing on his family, but he's started the kind of go and see type of thing. People go into the woods. Don't just sit on your couch and be on the internet and kind of tell everybody they're wrong and you've never actually walked out there yourself. And you don't have to be a researcher, but you go out there and see what's going on and, kind of explore your area. And another point, I've done a little research, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't the aspen trees have kind of some medicinal qualities as well, kind of similar to aspirin, I think, where it's anti-inflammatory, that type of...
Yeah, I heard a little bit about that. I don't know too much about that, but I do know that aspen is listed as one of the trees, along with certain kind of like sugar maples, obviously, and some birch trees back east that have edible bark. So I do know that if you look online, you'll find that aspens are considered one of those trees that have that when people were eating bark, they were eating these things. And you'll notice, too, that if you're in an area where the beaver tend to cut down the aspens before they cut down the pines. Okay, when you walk along a stream, they seem to hit all the aspens first. So there's probably some reason they prefer to chew and eat the aspens rather than the pines.
Yeah, and I've seen the same thing now that you mentioned it. Aspens that are leaning against pine trees. I've seen that multiple times. You don't think that much about it. There are leaning pine trees, but it's a repeating pattern. You do see aspens are leaning in pine trees, or multiple aspens on one pine tree. And it's interesting to just go out in the forest and see that over and over again. And like you say, you might pull it up. If the smaller ones, you can pull up the end of it and see there's no root structure there. It was definitely placed there. On occasion, it may be something that could have rotted away over decades, but a lot of them they're stripped of bark. I even have seen a video where something was freshly stripped. I mean, it was almost damp, and the thing was white and had been placed somewhere. I mean, it's rare you'll find one that fresh, but anyway, it's just more indication that it's not just nature letting it rot away.
Yeah, Rio had a video where he had, I don't remember what it is, but I remember seeing the video he had, and he showed just a freshly stripped aspen where the bark had literally just come off of it. And it was, right. I mean, it had to be within days because it was still moist. You know what I mean? And it was probably done that day or the night before. It was that cotton picking moist because these things will dry out pretty quick. And it's fairly dry around here. Within a couple of days, you're going to be able to notice.
Yeah, it still had that kind of white, shiny look on the video. You could tell it was at night, and they were shining a bright light on it to light it up. And so, yeah, that's exactly the one I remember. And
then my feeling in general with the other structures is that where you find really more of a shelter structure, I'm pretty well convinced it's the females that are building those when they have young, okay? And they're using it as an area, either a nursery to nurse the very small young, or as the young are fairly small still, a place to shelter them. Because I go to certain areas and I find those type of shelter structures, and I'll go to another area and it'll have all kinds of these treelings, but it won't have any of those shelter structures in it. Now, are those two different groups of Sasquatch that do things differently? Well, that's one explanation, okay? Or is one area a nursery area and one area more of a feeding area? The significant thing I found, when you find the actual structures that are like shelters, that are pushed over, have boughs on them and things like that, they are always located by water, within 100 yards or less of water. But where you find these trees leaned up against other trees, they can be half a mile or a mile from water. Or, where you find just little brush type stuff, more like day nests and things like that. Those things will be a little further distance from water. And I often find in those shelter structures, you find plastic water bottles that I figure, and I think Rio had pointed this out in some of his videos, they probably learned from seeing them that they pick them up and fill them with water and use them, just like we use them. You know what I mean? To carry water to where they're going to be spending some time.
Yeah, and I've seen that with the water bottles. And another thing I was going to mention, it seems like sometimes they're putting these structures in places where they know there's no hunting allowed. And not always. Sometimes you will see a structure and you probably can hunt there. But for instance, I don't want to name areas, but there's a place where there's no hunting allowed. Obviously, it'll be fairly close contact to people because it's near a campground, but there's no hunting allowed right there, and they probably feel kind of safe in that sense, even if there might be people around from time to time. Anyway, just
give me a good example of that. Just like you said, these campgrounds that are near a lake or near streams, near where people are camping, or near roads. That's what makes this thing crazy, is that they aren't take that much hiking to find. Because I've really hiked a long distance and gone into lakes and gone into other areas where I figured, well, if there's this stuff closer in, there should be more out in this other area. And voila, there's nothing there. There's no structures there. There's no tree liens there. But the difference is there's no campground and guys are up there hunting around those other lakes or those areas. But near the area where there's people and there's campgrounds, there's no hunting. And there's no, I think even more than the hunting is the bear hunting, people running their bear dogs. Here in Utah County, in these canyons, you've got guys running bear dogs. And I'm sure they just terrorize these things, particularly if they've got young. And they don't want to be anywhere near where they're running these cotton picking bear dogs. Because I've been out there in the woods when they run them through, those dogs. And they got everything in chaos when they're running around up there.
Yeah, at first glance, it's kind of counterintuitive that the campgrounds would offer some level of security, but it can. Even though some of these structures are right around campgrounds, you're often placed in such a way that nobody's ever going to walk up there because there's some physical barrier. Maybe it's a steep area or it's some briars. And sometimes it is easy to walk to, but you have to get off the trail and kind of bushwhack a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of people, Rex, just don't get off the trail, as you know. And I didn't get off the trail until I'd watched one of these videos from Rio. Then I deliberately said, hey, I'm not going to walk trails anymore. I'm just going to go out and walk around in the woods. And that's when I started finding all this stuff. And once I found it and kind of learned what to look for, now I don't really go anywhere that I don't find this stuff. I've been down in the La Salle Mountains and, down near Moab and found structures in those mountains. I've been up north by Ogden, some of those canyons, gone to areas and found structures. I've been up outside of Salt Lake City, up near Guardsman Pass, found structures right up off the hillside, not far from the road. And I build on steep slopes. Again, scouts wouldn't build these things. They'd roll down the hill. They wouldn't build it right there. I can't say why Sasquatch built them there, why they picked this particular spot, but it's a place that people just wouldn't go to the work to build that thing right where these things were being built. It just made no sense. And then I think we've both seen a couple of structures like what I talked about, cabin sort of structures, but they're not really built to accommodate a roof. They're just basically built with walls as a windbreak, I guess, around the sides, but really not structured to keep snow or rain or anything from falling straight down and coming inside them. Now, I have seen ones with roofs, but about half of them can't accommodate that. So,
kind of sometimes it's like a little fence, almost like a pen for maybe, like you're saying, a young one or I don't know what. But occasionally it looks like they're less often, but sometimes they might have, this is some other theory, that they might have things that are territorial markers or what have you, but those usually aren't as elaborate. There might be just a few things kind of in a teepee or something like that. But anyway.
What I see there, I call them knots, okay, K-N-O-T. And they look like, because there's a couple of hillsides that you've got these things that look like these log jams that you see on rivers. A bunch of trees crisscrossed every direction, but huge trees. I mean, we're talking trees 2 or 3 times the size of telephone poles, okay, in these structures, making a big mass right on and it's usually on the hill, on the crest of a hill or side of a hill. Now, first of all, no river drugged these things there. Yeah, a few of them were pushed over in place, and a bunch of them had to be drugged there. And again, they're not just piled up, they're interwound with each other. My feeling on those things is this is Big Daddy saying, hey, this is my area, stay out, and to show you how big and tough I am, I'm going to make something of the biggest cotton-picking things I can possibly haul over here. I think you saw that picture that I took, and I think you've seen it, of that teepee up one of these local canyons. Now, that's interesting. There's lots of teepees around. That's nothing spectacular about a teepee, other than this teepee is made out of telephone poles.
Oh, really?
Literally 3 of the trees in this are the size of telephone poles, 10 inches in diameter more, 40 feet long or longer, okay, in the middle of a clearing. So they didn't just,
They pick somewhere where it's visible to those who are educated and know what to look for.
That's right. And in an area where it's not humanly possible to get any kind of equipment. First of all, people couldn't build it because the trees are so long that they couldn't get them up in the air. Well, if they got a block and tackle, they're in the clearing, so there's nothing to hook the block and tackle to. You can say, well, they brought in a crane. No, they didn't bring in a crane. We're talking a mile away from a road up in the trails, and you know what kind of destruction bringing heavy equipment into the forest does. I mean, right. It doesn't get repaired for years. Yeah, I mean, nothing. And then the other side of the coin, this thing is right next to a trail, and probably the people, and by next to the trail, I mean within 50, 60 feet of a trail, I would say 99% of people walking the trail never notice it because it's made out of trees, it's natural, it's sitting there, and they never get a few feet off the trail to look at it. I literally walked right into it when the first time I saw it, and then realized, hey, what is this thing here? So, and there are those things. Now, that's the largest teepee I've ever seen. But that same area has a number of very, very large structures made out of the same size trees scattered about on different hillsides.
Yeah, I've seen several things very similar to that. I don't want to go into detail, but yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Well, I guess we've been going for quite a while now. We're well over 30 minutes. Should we just change gears real quick and talk a little bit about your other area of expertise, the antique firearms?
Well, if you'd like to, I mean, what I do as a living is I buy and sell. I'm a dealer in antique military items from the 1800s. Now, this is more of a passion for me than simply a job, and is part of the reason why I've always been so interested in this stuff. It's not that I'm as interested in the firearms when I began this. I'm interested in the history of the Old West. And so the Pony Express and settlers coming west and the whole thing really fascinated me. Much more than the ordinary person. I realized the only way I could learn this stuff is practical hands-on. As you can tell, I've gone out in the desert and looked at what these places these guys were traveling through were like. Look at the places they've camped. Why did they camp here? What sort of food were they taking? You know what I mean? And you can see all those sort of remnants. And it became pretty clear to me early on that unless you understood the firearms, which were so important a way of life with people back in the 1800s, I mean settlers in particular, you couldn't really understand their reasoning and motivations for doing a lot of what they did because they had to be safe and they had to have they could only do things that dictated what they could do with the firearms that they happened to have at their disposal at the time. So that's what kind of got me into the firearms things. And I've done a lot. I've even written about it. I've written articles about it. I've written a novel about it. So this is a fairly serious passion with me over the years. And it grew into a business, and it's my full-time business now. I work with it. My one son's full-time, another son's part-time. And, hey, we make a nice living, but more importantly, it gives me plenty of time to walk around in the woods.
Yeah, it sounds like a good balance to me. I mean, I think you don't even need an FFL license or a curio relic license to sell these. They're still considered antiques. Is that correct to say? I think you've told me.
Yeah, that's right. They're not considered fireable. They're made prior to the year 1898. Which, you know, a certain number of them are, but they had to make a designation somewhere. And the vast majority are not. People just buy them to buy an old gun just to look at it. Or more likely put it in a safe and never look at it. But that's, you know, men have to collect things, and this is something that a lot of people over the years have collected. So anyway, it's interesting to me, and I kind of deal with it as professional treasure hunting, you know. I enjoy it. It still gets my heart beating. I still get excited about it. So I'll do it until I can't even get up and move around anymore.
Yeah, I think you actually do travel in the United States to acquire new purchases for auctions, right? I mean, I sometimes occasionally call you and you'll say, you know, I'm out of town right now. I'm in Atlanta or wherever.
Yeah, no, I've traveled a fair amount. You know, I haven't traveled. It'll be about a month from my last trip. The last trip I went was back to Maine and then to Oklahoma. My next trip is in Denver in about 3 weeks. And then I go back to Illinois here at the end of June and, I think Reno. And I haven't really decided what I'm going to do over the summer, where I'm going to go yet.
You ever do any trade shows? I'm assuming they have things for like that. Or
Yeah, no, a lot of that traveling is to trade shows. I only take stuff to sell. I primarily sell everything online.
Right.
So I only set up at a relatively few shows. I don't find the trade shows pay as well to sell at, but they're good to buy at. So, but I don't go to just regular old gun show. I don't go to any shows here in Utah. There's one small one in Ogden I go to, but I just go to the shows to buy stuff. And then, but there are a few, about 7 a year, I think, where I actually take all my inventory set up and then try to sell. But don't do that. Mostly sell everything online.
And what's your website? I have looked at it before. I don't have the link in front of me. I can place it maybe at the end of this video, but what's the name of it again? Where can they find you?
Antiqueguns.com. Antiqueguns.com.
Okay, so that's easy to remember.
Yeah, I picked that up real early on, on the internet. Should have bought a lot more, domains. But and just before people were picking up domains, I picked that up. And because I've had passion for this for quite a while. I've been doing this for quite a long time.
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine if that were still available now, people would be trying to scalp someone with, to charge them for the domain name. But let's see. Yeah, I don't know if I had any other questions on that. I know I did show you, I'm sure you've seen thousands of guns, and I know you have a lot online, but my own personal story with that is my grandmother had an old Manton revolver, and she used to call it the sea captain's gun because we had a relative who basically I believe it's a flintlock or something like that. I sent you a photo of it, and you kind of gave me a ballpark estimate of. Apparently, there was a box, and it should have had a second one with it, but that one, I think, another relative that she knew, which I don't know, nobody knows now, but they have the other one. And anyway, so yeah, the history like that is really interesting to know where they come from, what they were used for during someone's lifetime, tools that they were used sometimes to save people's lives, sometimes otherwise. But anyway, just interesting history there.
Yeah. Well, that's a big part of why I'm interested in this stuff. It's not just the guns in and of themselves, but right. You've got a logo that you have. You're dressed in a cowboy hat and you're holding a Winchester Model 1894 rifle. Yeah. You probably know what that was. They made that gun. That's kind of interesting. People don't realize they made that gun from 1894 to 1950. That's how well made and designed these guns were. Think about that in the late 1800s. They made that cotton picking gun for 55 years. They didn't make the same model car for 55 years or the same model anything for that long. But these guns were so well made. But that's because they were so important to people, they had to be well made because people's lives were depending on it. But that's just one example. And Winchester, of course, was incredibly successful because they made great stuff. And, that gun that you're holding was designed by John Browning. I don't know if you know that or not. He designed all those late guns by Winchester.
Yeah, John Browning. I think he was a Utah at some point. And
John Browning's. He came out with the original 144 settlers. He was one of the 144. Mm-hmm. He had there is a gun shop in Nauvoo, Illinois, where he had his gun shop there. He came out here. He settled in Ogden. He had, I think, 7 or 9 sons, I believe, that carried on his business. They developed some of the most important patents. They had the water-cooled machine gun that was used during World War I. At one time, all the semi-automatic pistols by both Colt and the competing pistols were John Browning's patterns. Now at this point it's John Browning Jr., you know what I mean, who's designing these things. He was unbelievable, but he didn't have the money that these big companies did. So what happened is that he designed the guns and then would sell the patent rights to these other companies. And he did it to Ballard, to Colt, to Savage, to Winchester, all their guns they designed from like 1885 on until about 1905 were all John Browning's designs. He was amazing. The guy was a genius when it came to designing firearms.
Yeah, I was just thinking he must have been really industrious and ingenious to come up with so many reliable designs over his lifetime. I think I heard look at some existing models and then he would make something far better, really improve upon it and sell it and that type of thing. But yeah, the one you're talking about, it's actually a Rossi reproduction. It's Brazilian. It's less expensive, but still the basic design. So I like that type of lever action rifle. So yeah, I have that. Anyway, anything else you wanted to add, or anything we didn't cover either topic?
Well, there's a whole bunch. I mean, we've only touched the surface. I've seen tracks numerous times.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You did tell
I've
me.
got recordings of
Remember a story.
numerous knocks, you know what I mean, in the woods. I've never seen a Sasquatch, never seen one. Okay.
Right.
Have I gotten real close where I thought, well, I've heard movement in the brush, but that, like I said, I talked about that bluff charge, but never saw what was making the movement. So it could have been a cow, something big moving around. But I've had a multitude of experiences. This is about 4 years now of me hiking probably 50 or 60 days every summer in the woods. So I've got probably about 200 days out there in these nearby canyons hiking around. And, you know, I've had a lot of where nothing happened, but I've had some really interesting things happen.
Yeah, and I think they've, just in my theory of observation, it seems like they've gotten really proficient, or maybe they've always been proficient, about hiding from humans, especially down here in the 48 lower states. I think in Canada and Alaska, they're a little more at ease because no one is literally around very often. But down here, one of the only times I've heard them is if I hadn't slipped on a snowy trail downhill and crashed and then start muttering, I wouldn't have heard it because all of a sudden I heard a whoop woo off in the distance. And apparently they must have been alongside me the whole time, but I never would have heard anything unless I, slipped and fell like that, and it kind of took them off guard. And so just things like that, they're there, but, at most you're going to hear them. You might not even hear them or even know that they're there. So.
And, well, they may not be there, too. I mean, that's the other side of the coin. You really never know what's out there.
Of course, yeah.
And at this point, all I can say is there's indications, but I'm not going to sit there and say, they're definitely there. And as far as my opinion, these are animals. Any other sort of thing about them being, I don't even want to get into that. These are animals. I don't think we're breaking the laws of physics here, as known by humans.
Oh yeah,
but
other
they're just
theories of. I guess we won't get into that, but
yeah, but they're incredibly intelligent, great eyesight. And think about it. Neanderthals had eyeballs twice our size. Neanderthals did. Now,
huge sockets.
What could they see, and why did they need eyeballs that good? Well, they obviously needed those to see in the dark, because our eyes are fine for seeing in the daytime. We don't need bigger eyes to capture more light at night. And there's a lot of indications, a lot of videos where they talk about eye shine. Well, it's either that or, well, I don't think they're generating any light, but I think that they're good, have such a large iris that they absorb so much light that they appear to glow even in low light conditions. We've all been out in the woods, you know what I mean, and spotlighting and seeing coyotes and bobcats and that, and you recognize them by their eye shine. I mean, it looks like they're little flashlights out there, when you hit them in the dark at night. Well, if their eyes were even bigger, that eye shine may be that bright in just lesser light, and you may not have to be that dark to see that kind of shine.
And with that, I'll add the infrared spectrum is not that far out of our visual spectrum, really. And if, they had larger eyes, maybe it's not really breaking the laws of physics, and maybe they could see that type of thing. Just, for instance, cameras, or they seem to miraculously avoid, but maybe it's just that they're, I think we talked about this before, they can just see some of the
well,
infrared.
I'm convinced now. I've had a number of cameras, and this is my big rub with some of the Bigfoot community, is these guys think they have a open range to destroy, $300 or $400 cameras because they see them in a tree, because they think they own an area, And so I've lost close to a couple $1,000s worth of equipment by guys throwing rocks at them or stealing them or the like. Yeah, not all of them are Bigfoot guys, but some of them are, because I get pictures of them doing it. These are cameras, people. Think about it for a minute, people, But I'm convinced now, after all the different, and not just watching Sasquatch, but watching other animals, that certain animals can see the infrared. Dogs don't seem to see it. By that I mean foxes, coyotes don't seem to see it. And deer don't seem to see it. And elk don't seem to see it, because they just walk up in the cameras like they're not there. They don't pay any attention. But when there's cats, I've got mountain lions and bobcats in particular, boy, they are right on those cameras, okay? Those cameras go off and they're looking right at the cameras, okay? They're either that or they're slinking away from the camera. I get a picture of them as they're going the other way, okay? I have coyotes, though, that literally silhouette themselves, you know what I mean? Like they're taking a picture, in front of the the camera. And I've had a bear do that too. You know what I mean? Just full broadside. But the cats don't do that. And by come to the camera, I mean literally come to the camera and you follow them in the film. They'll come up, jump up on the tree, and they'll start trying to gnaw on the camera or whatever to get at the camera. And I've seen eye shine, high eye shine, way off at the farthest reach of what the camera can see. And all I see is the shine, and I see the shine pop up in the video, and then it suddenly moves off real quickly. Okay, well, could it have been an owl? Well, yeah, I guess it could have been an owl, but the eyes they're too wide apart to be an owl. But I'm convinced Sasquatch see these infrared lights, and I'm convinced they're just very cautious when they come into anything. They just don't come marching in. They just come in very slowly, even into areas where they've been before, and enough so that they'll set this stuff off from a distance. Once they see the cameras there, they just don't tend to go by them anymore. So I think to be successful with infrared cameras, what you probably need to do is set them up in areas where you've already got lights, because they'll go over near garbage cans and that are already lit up at night. Well, if you set it over there next to a light where they're used to seeing a light, there's a possibility that you may be able to catch them. Okay? But I've had cameras out, and I can't say I have any image of one of these things, but they know the cameras are there. Do they see the camera? Or there's vision so good they can see the camera when it's not lit up? Well, that's possible too. But I'm convinced they see the infrared, and then they just stay away. But I wouldn't know that if I didn't have the cameras out there. And let me tell you, part of the reason I see that is if you set up two infrared cameras so they're filming each other, okay, at 30, 40 feet apart, and then an animal walks in, you can't believe how bright the other camera will be as it goes off, okay, in the eyes of the camera that you're photographing it with. It's literally like a car headlight. It looks that bright, you know what I mean? So it's not like it's even a question. It's not a dim little light. It's a flash, a bright flash in the wood that's very easy to spot if you can see the infrared.
So the other camera's capturing it, and you can see, because it has the ability to see that it's extremely bright.
Oh, yeah.
So we can't see it. But
you can see, like, I've got a good video of a deer walking in front of one camera and another camera taking a picture of it. And you see the deer get lit up because it goes off like a flash. So it goes ba-da-da-da-da, real fast flash. And you can see the one side of the deer all lit up. You can see the shadow of the deer because the infrared's bright enough. It's casting a shadow against trees behind it. You know what I mean? And it's so bright where the infrared's going off, it literally looks like the headlight of a car. That's how bright it appears, at least in the other camera. I don't think it's that bright, but plenty bright that you could see it from 100 yards or 50 yards or something with good vision could, which would be well out of the view of where the camera could actually see you. You really got to be within 50 feet of one of those cameras, even the best ones, before they're going to be able to see you, at least in dark. They'll see you, at a mile away in daylight, but in the dark, you got to be about that close to be seen.
Well, that's an interesting thought. Have an area that is already generally fairly well lit, at least for night, and have a camera there. Because I know, in the middle of a dark forest, if any little light's going to, if you can see a reflection of a spider's eyes, even, if you do that, anything shows up. So yeah.
So I just think that's a big, and there's always a chance, and there've been people catch them completely unawares. They've walked under something. You know what I mean? There's supposedly a few good pictures out there, but I think that's why. And these skeptics say, well, they can't catch them on infrared cameras. Well, just watch what bobcats do when they get caught on infrared cameras. These cotton picking things don't hang around here and pose. They either go to the camera or they get out and dodge. They know the camera's there. There's no doubt about it. You watch how they respond to it.
And then Sasquatch with his larger brain, and he's curious as well, but he's not curious like a cat that puts his nose right in front of it. You might catch, I think I've seen a cam where they maybe got the brush of one's arm or something. They're very cautious. So.
Well, but like I said, about these campgrounds, they had built these screens. They're obviously very cautious around people, around things that they think people have.
Rightly so. Yeah.
So they're very, very cautious. They would have to be. If they're just out blundering around in the brush, they'd be walking up on people all the time. Okay? So that makes perfect sense to me, how if they come into an area, so if these people that are saying, well, we're out there talking to them, we sit in an area where we know they are, I wouldn't sit in the middle of the area where I know they were. I would go up the hillside overlooking that area. okay, and put your back to something so they can't come up from you behind. Not to say that they're going to tear you apart, but also, I've been out there in the woods and heard the sound, heard this moving in the brush, and then turn around and then it stops. Then I go back to what I'm looking away from it, and then I hear a movement I hear something moving between brush to brush or tree to tree, and then I turn around and it stops. Okay? Well,
Yep.
you know what I should have done is I should have set a camera up on a tripod, because the cameras now, you can get a little screen, and I can literally look away from something, but I can be photographing over my shoulder. Okay? That's something I haven't done yet, but that's something I plan to do this summer, is get my tripod. If I get in that situation again, is try that same thing, is a photograph over my shoulder, but while I'm looking away.
So kind of like a brace or like a kind of a rig that where it's pointing behind you, that type of thing?
Well, just put the camera on a tripod, but if you've got one of these new digital cameras, you don't photograph through the eyepiece, you photograph off the little screen, okay, that's on the side. Well, those screens, they flip out to the side and they spin around. So I don't have to be standing behind the camera. I can be standing in front of the camera and still see what the camera is photographing,
Okay, got it, yeah.
And they all have those screens now. I mean, they all of at least all the cameras I look at have the screens. So it's not like that's difficult. That would be very simple to do. And just be looking away from the camera. There's a great video, and it actually happened here in Utah. You've probably seen it, where there's some kids sleigh riding on a hillside in the snow. And up on the top of the hill, in the background, they keep catching glimpses of these 3 Sasquatches move across the top of the hill and hide. Well, every time they scan right there and look at the Sasquatch freezes, okay? But it's when they start to turn away, or when they turn away, then you get the movement. And one time you got a Sasquatch literally standing there by itself, right on top of the hillside, but when the camera pans over it, it just freezes. And then the camera pans away, pans back, and then it's gone. I mean, this great big thing, it suddenly disappears from being on top of this hill. And I'm sure you've seen that. That's on YouTube, a well-known video, or series of 3 videos, because it's 3 different videos.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that. There's like a family, they're just watching their kids, they're photographing them, and then, like you're saying, off in the distance, you see the way it moves, it kind of scampers, and when it is moving, and it kind of, like a human, it looks a little abnormal for a human to be moving that way. At least that's my memory.
Well,
you can't see it that well.
Yeah, there's 3 Sasquatches in the video, and it appears to be one. Anyway, who knows what they are? They're all about the same size, but it appears that one of them in particular, one of the Sasquatches, is like got multiple sclerosis or something. The left side of its body appears to be paralyzed. So when it moves, you can see that it's dragging its left leg and it's throwing its right arm up. You know what I mean?
Maybe that's what it was. I know it was kind of weird. I wasn't paying that much attention, but yeah, it does.
Yeah, one of them really moves, and then the other 2 kind of scamper away, and you can see at one time even 2 of them moving at one time in one of the scenes. Anyway, it's worth looking up. Who was it? Thing that no longer videos stuff. I can't remember the name of the guys. They put up a bunch of videos, and it was one of their top Sasquatch videos. But that happened here in Utah.
It was Facebook Find. I can't remember.
Facebook Find Bigfoot or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I could tell you a whole story of how they got run off the internet by trolls. Anyway, a lot of criticism. Anyway.
They have another video that they didn't claim was in Utah, but was actually at the same canyon. I believe that canyon is Providence Canyon, up by Logan, south, or actually outside of Hiram. And there's target shooting, and it may even be the same family, because the lady sure sounds the same, seems to be the same voice. But you can see him target shooting, and they shoot a shotgun. A kid, 12-year-old kid fires a shotgun, and you see this in the background again, this creature moving across the hillside, okay, suddenly with the big shot, and it goes down on its hands and knees. Now, this thing is as tall on its hands and knees as a human is. I mean, standing. I mean, it is huge on this hillside as it scampers across the hillside. And again, it's in the background. They're not videoing it, So, it comes in and out and in and out and in and out as they're going to the gun, and the kids and the people are talking because they're photographing a family event, and this Sasquatch stuff's going on in the background. And this is one where there's a helicopter. You keep hearing a helicopter flying around in the area, and the people are saying that they think probably the helicopter is seeing the Sasquatch, and that's why it keeps flying in there close. And anyway, this is apparently in the same sort of area from what I understand. I heard somebody tell me that once.
And was that a video also, or is this a story?
Yeah,
that
this is on Facebook.
Area?
Find Bigfoot too.
Yes. Okay,
this is another one of their videos.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like another interesting one. So they actually fire the 12 gauge, and the thing reacts, and kind of they're waving it around, and it's kind of like dodging around, like that type of thing, or.
Well, they're shooting at 22, and there's nothing kind of moving in the background. And this is on a hillside. The hillside is 200 yards behind where they're shooting. And then they hand the kid the shotgun, and the shotgun goes off, and you see run maybe 40 feet across the hillside. This dark creature runs across the hillside, up on the hill behind where they're shooting, okay, but not directly behind, off to the side, but in line with where the dad or whoever's doing the photography. Well, then the camera's panning around because, again, remember, they're following the family. They're not following the Bigfoot. And they pan back, and you see the Bigfoot, and it gets down on its kind of hands and knees. Well, by hands and knees, I mean its arms are down and the legs are hunched down. It's kind of like so the head's up still high, kind of like you'd think a gorilla would hunch, but the rear end is down low, okay? But the hands are clearly on the ground. And it's there. The shotgun goes off again, and it scurries off away. So it doesn't do anything with the 22, but when the shotgun's fired, boy, that caused that Sasquatch to get up and take some notice. So anyway, it's worth looking. You'll find on YouTube.
That's a big difference in sound between those two calibers. Yeah. And it sounds like he's trying to make himself a smaller target, or that type of thing.
Well, he's not in line with where they're shooting. Oh, okay. He's watching them. And then he hears this go off, and then he's thinking, well, maybe I better get out of Dodge,
okay. Or
something. I'm putting what my thoughts. I have no idea what a Sasquatch is thinking, but what it appears.
Seems
anyway,
like
watch the video.
Well, anything else you want to add? I think I've exhausted my questions I had here.
No, nothing else other than just people got to understand. I've seen footprints. I got photographs of footprints. I've seen footprints basically in the snow. Another situation where I went up with the camp host, okay? The road wasn't even opened yet, okay? So we go up, he moves a gate, but he had to go check the campground. So we drive up, and there are great big patches of snow. No vehicles had been up the road yet. There had been snowmobiles up the road, but there had been no vehicles up the road. We finally get to the entrance of the campground, and it's a big, long walkway, and it's several hundred yards, and there's some footprints in there, some people in the snow, but there's no snowmobile or anything has been up this since the snow's fallen. So we hawk into there, and there's a little Sasquatch cabin right off the road, so I wanted to go in and check that. And sure enough, I'm just stepping off the road, and right there is a footprint, okay? I mean, toes and the whole bit. I mean, a clear footprint, and I've got a video of this online showing you this thing. Now, for anybody to say, well, somebody walked around there with plastic feet, okay? That didn't happen, know.
What size was this? I mean, just curious.
Well, I put my foot. I wore a pretty big shoe. I got a size 14 shoe. My foot is about 15 inches, and that foot is bigger than mine, so it's about 18 inches. Okay, right next to mine. Fairly narrow, long foot, clearly four toes, clearly visible. I've got the video up there and posted, and I've got another time where I went up the same canyon. And right after a snowstorm, right on the 1st of April, this was a couple of years ago, and all kinds of several, like a family Bigfoot walked through this area. And I've got several different size footprints. I even walk along to show my stride versus the stride of this Bigfoot in two different instances, going up a hill and going down a hill. You can clearly see their footprints in much better line. And, I'm a good sized guy. I'm 6'3", I'm 275 pounds. Got a big foot. I look like just a little kid in relation to what you're seeing this other stuff, particularly the stride lengths. You can't, you can't. Yeah. And like climb up the hillside, clearly the creature going up the hillside was dragging something like a bough or some boughs or something behind it, but you can see its footprints clearly. It walks straight up the hill. Now, the hill gets so steep, I have to walk and turn my feet sideways and go up sideways, and eventually I just had to turn around and come down, and this thing just kept plowing up the cotton picking hill. Much bigger tracks than I have, straight up the hill, in snow, and the snow had just fallen, so those tracks literally had just been there, made like the night before. I mean, this was real fresh stuff. So there's all sorts of stuff like this, and if somebody who's a skeptic really wants to find out, there's plenty of stuff out there, okay? They just want to shoot off their mouth, and they don't want to really spend a little bit of time and find out if there's something going on.
Yeah, just a few comments. Yeah, 18 inches, that's right in line with Bigfoot size. And I'm just wondering, it seems like they're so heavy they can just sink into even if it's of a steep grade, they can just kind of get some footing and just keep going up. I'm assuming part of it is their sheer weights, I would think. One other thing, I remember one time, I'm just thinking here as you're talking, we accompanied Rio and myself. We did go up to this specific canyon, a canyon, before the gates were open, and then there was a ranger there to greet us, and he kind of showed us around. And he told a story, I believe, where he actually heard a quite loud vocalization in the middle of the night one time, didn't he? It sounded like a scream and something up on the hillside, or just things like that.
Yeah, if that's the same guy that I've talked to, the camp host, actually that wasn't the only time. He had several different instances. Oh. He stayed all summer long, at the campground and camped right there in a trailer, and he'd sleep with his window open every night. And he actually heard some, up on the hillside, but he saw all sorts of stuff. I mean, I was up there seeing him all the time and talked to him about different things that would get made and taken apart, and different campgrounds, things going on in every campground in the canyon. Every one of the camp hosts had different sorts of stories. None of them saw anything, but all of them saw structures suddenly appear, disappear. All of them saw footprints. And this is right here in Utah. I mean, there aren't supposed to be Sasquatches around here. Yeah, but nobody's been looking for them.
Exactly. Well, we should mention your channel on YouTube. If somebody wants to take a look at some of Rob's handiwork, go to Rob Robles, just type that into YouTube, and he'll come right up, and he does have quite a few videos posted there. Okay, well, thanks for your time.